A few years after Israel won our freedom from British rule, a remarkable series of antique letters were discovered in the Judean desert. They were the letters of Bar Kokhba, the last commander of the ancient Israeli army, during the final chapter of our struggle for freedom against Rome. The letters, addressed to various officers under his command, carried on them Bar Kokhba's personal signature. And while this alone is an incredible archaeological discovery, it's not the most amazing part of our story. The true miracle lies in the fact that the person who found the letters of the last Israeli commander was the well-known archaeologist General Yigal Yadin, effectively the first commander of the new Israeli army. For 1,820 years, Bar Kokhba's letters lay hidden in the Judean desert, in clay pots where they were preserved for some unknown future date when the nation of Israel would eventually return to our soil. No one had even touched them. The letters were awaiting their final destination. And then, as if by personal delivery, the military directives of the last chief of staff reached Israel's first chief of staff nearly 2,000 years later. This isn't a fantasy, this is reality, this happened. The letters may have arrived a little late, but they fell into the right hands, delivered from army to army, from commander to commander. And when you visit the Israel Museum in Jerusalem and see these letters, you can comprehend their meaning even without being able to read them. You can understand that the story of the Jewish people is an extraordinary drama verging on the sublime. And hopefully, you could even understand that that story isn't finished, and that we wouldn't have been born into one of the most amazing and climactic chapters of Jewish history if we aren't supposed to play a major role in that story. Okay. But that's not the only story taking place. There's another story taking place simultaneously. Story of a people, mostly rural peasantry, living for whatever it is, hundreds of years, maybe more, in one of the backwater provinces of the Ottoman Empire, farming the land under them, usually not owning the land under them, but farming it for the absentee landlords and feeding their families with what they farm and giving what they need to give to the landlords. And then suddenly, these strange people from a faraway land start trickling into the country, these Zionists. At first, no problem. In fact, at first it's beneficial. And then there's a big war, and the Ottomans no longer rule the country. Now these funny foreigners, the British, rule the country. And while this is happening, more and more Zionists are coming. And some of them are buying the land under the peasantry from the absentee landlords. And suddenly people who've been working their lands and providing for their families from these lands for generations aren't able to do that anymore because these lands are being used for, kibbutzim and moshavim, different communities. And the British are very clever. They know how to divide and rule native populations. And they create a conflict. They create a conflict in 1920. The Middle East conflict is really the brainchild of a man named Lord George Curzon, who became the Foreign Secretary of England in 1919. The British had two very important interests in Palestine. One was the Suez Canal to the west, and the other was the oil to the east, that they would pipe in from what's now northern Iraq to Haifa, where they would refine the oil and ship it off to the rest of the empire. So the British decided, right after getting a mandate, which was really a nice way of saying colony post-World War I, or a very thin mask for a colony post-World War I. And as soon as they got this mandate from the League of Nations to rule Palestine, they did everything in their power to make it impossible, just like the French were trying to do in Syria, or the British were also trying to do in Mesopotamia, to make it impossible for the indigenous peoples to achieve self-determination. so that the British and also the French can stay forever. Right? And in 1948, there's a big war. And these two stories I told have a very different version of what happened in 1948. Right? Meaning two movies are playing out simultaneously. Right? And both are true. And one of the problems we have, and I'm sure one of the problems you have at Columbia University, is that each side feels threatened by the other side's narrative. Right? That people feel that, I meet a lot of Jews, people I respect, people who care about, who have a strong national consciousness and care about advancing Jewish history, and are really active participants in Jewish history in Israel, who can't bring themselves to acknowledge the existence of a Palestinian people. Because they feel that acknowledging a Palestinian people will right away threaten their story, will right away threaten their rights, threaten their identity, will disenfranchise them in some way. And I work with a lot of Palestinians, and I know that in Palestinian society, to acknowledge the existence of a Jewish people already threatens their identity, already threatens their narrative. Because their narrative rests on the notion that Jews are not a people, we're a religion, we're a bunch of Europeans, we're colonialists. And the state of Israel is a settler colonialist state that needs to be erased, right, to make the world a better place. According to their narrative, that makes a lot of sense. According to their narrative, according to the movie they're living in, you can't compromise. There is no two-state solution, and the Palestinian street isn't interested in a two-state solution. Those who were are way past it. Because you can't compromise with people who have no right to exist. And I think it's very important, in order to my job as what's called an alternative peace activist, is to try to create a bigger movie that's inclusive enough to encompass both ostensibly rival movies. And I believe that's possible. I know it's possible because we're doing it. And you have people on both sides who are participating in this. Not just two sides, actually three sides, because our group includes not only Jews and Palestinians, but also foreign nationals, like idealistic white people who come from Europe and America to come and help the Palestinians live in Ramallah, and after a couple of years, of harassing soldiers, kind of realize that the situation is a little bit different than what they saw on TV. Right? Not that the Palestinians aren't being oppressed, they are. They are living under a military bureaucracy. There is an occupation. And there are walls, and there are checkpoints, and there are restrictions of freedom of movement. And it's not fair, and it's not right, and it has to stop. The status quo is not tenable. But at the same time, the West Bank is the cradle of Jewish civilization. It's where we're from. It's where our culture developed. And it's where we've aspired to return to for thousands of years. Right? And I'm not willing to compromise on that. So what do we do?
I know it just hit me funny, the use of the word West Bank, the term West Bank, in terms of that is definitely associated with a certain narrative.
Yes. Well, not anymore. Fortunately or unfortunately, that's become the neutral term almost.
Even though it's historically,
I'll tell you, hopefully in under a minute, the history of the term West Bank. You know when it first came into use?
1968.
1950, in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Because, I relate to 1948, by the way, differently than the Palestinians do, but I also relate to 1948 differently than AIPAC or Stand With Us or, the Foreign Ministry of Israel would. I consider 1948 to be a war that we lost. And the reason why I consider it to be a war that we lost is because we lost Jerusalem, and we lost Gaza City, and we lost Hebron, and we lost Kfar Tzion, and we lost Kfar Darom, and we lost Shechem, and we lost Beit Lechem, we lost Shiloh, we lost Beit El. So how could we win a Zionist war if Zion is not in our hands? We won against the British, meaning according to British documents, according to the official British government position, they left Palestine for one reason. Do you guys know the reason? Can anybody tell me why the British left Palestine according to them?
The mandate was up.
No. Jewish terrorism. They left Palestine because of Jewish terrorism, and if not for Jewish terrorism, they would be in Palestine today. The British left because of Jewish terrorism. We won a war against the British. But the British were very good at this game. And they armed, trained, and led 2 armies into Palestine right after they left. The Egyptian military and the Transjordanian Arab Legion were armed, trained, and led by British officers. And they both succeeded in taking territory from us. They both crossed the border, invaded Palestine, took territory from us. Transjordan annexed what it took from us. Illegally. It was only recognized by Britain and Pakistan. Transjordan changes its own name to Jordan, because now it's on both sides of the Jordan. And in 1950, the Encyclopedia Britannica calls Samaria and Judea the West Bank, in order to legitimize Jordan's claim. That's where the term comes from, but that's what the world uses today. Even though you're right, in 1947, the United Nations referred to the territories as Samaria and Judea. Right? And the British had referred to it as that before. That's what the world considered today. But today, if you're exclusively using those terms, especially if you say Judea and Samaria, sometimes I get very annoyed because people are going to a very specific place. They're going to Hebron, Judea. And they say, I'm in Judea and Samaria. You're not in Judea and Samaria. You're in Judea. Right? It's not a synonym for West Bank. They're 2 different places. I actually live in Benjamin. I live next to Ramallah in a place called Beit El. A couple days ago, I met with some activists at CUNY Queens. They would define themselves, I think, as Maoists. You know what a Maoist is? Okay. It's like Marxism for the third world, for developing countries. Right? Believes that instead of the working class, you have the peasantry, like they're the revolutionary actor, and guerrilla warfare is basically, the favored means of struggle. And one of the first things I said to them is that I live in, thousands of years ago, my people waged a guerrilla war against the Seleucid Greek Empire. And the partisan camp is where I live. Right? The Maccabees had their headquarters in the hills of Gofna, in Beit El. And if somebody visits me, I could show them where Yehuda Maccabee was killed, and where Matityahu died. Right? And where Yaakov had his dream, if you choose to believe that there was a dream with a ladder and angels going up and down the ladder. But whether that story is true or not, what's true is that the Jewish people believe it happened in a very specific place. And the fact that we believe it happened in a very specific place is a sign of our indigeneity. Because indigenous peoples, you go to countries anywhere in the world, especially developing countries, you meet the natives. They have a myth or a legend about almost every mountain, every rock, every valley. Here 2 dragons made love and a volcano erupted. All these things are signs of being indigenous, that you have stories about the mountains where you live. That's not a sign of a colonialist. So they got this. They understood what I was saying. And it was a very productive meeting, Baruch Hashem. But that was your only question, the term West Bank? Your name?
Sefi.
Okay.
So, you probably don't hear this a lot, but when I was listening to you speak, I was very strongly reminded of Peter Beinart. Okay. And the reason for
I don't hear that a lot.
The reason for that is because similar to when I read or listen to Peter Beinart, I'm with you, like, all the way. We look at the same history, we draw the same preliminary conclusions from that history, and then you lose me at the end.
I didn't get to the end.
But
where did I lose you?
Well, you said that you don't believe that we could ever compromise on.
I don't believe we can partition our small country.
So that's what I assumed you meant by compromise there.
I think we can compromise on a lot of things, but we have to know what we can compromise on.
So then I'll wait and hear the rest.
Yeah.
So,
Josh, right?
Josh. You don't seem to be distinguishing between Jewish people and Judaism as a religion. And
I don't believe
Zionism.
in Judaism as a religion.
Okay,
I believe there's a Jewish people with a national culture
Okay.
that came to resemble a religion a couple hundred years ago. Meaning in the ghettos of Europe for hundreds of years, Jews lived separate from the native populations and organized their communal life based on the indigenous culture of Palestine. Okay? That laid the festivals, the strings on their garments, the tefillot, all of those things were were a portable version of their national culture from their homeland. And during the time of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, this came to resemble a religion. And a lot of Jews who wanted to leave the ghettos and become Germans or French or what have you, started to regard their Jewish identity as a religious identity in order to fit in Europe.
All right, so let me phrase the question differently. Do you believe that Jews would still be after political sovereignty in Israel if not for European nationalism?
Yes.
Okay.
But I think European nationalism was a very effective tool in us achieving that liberation. I'll say this, I teach a class on 10 streams of Zionism, even though I think there are more. But these 10 streams really fall into two categories. There's the Zionism that views the Jewish people as an object with a problem. That problem could be anti-Semitism, persecution, assimilation, whatever you want. And Zionism is the potential solution to the problem. But there are other potential solutions. It could be socialism, right? And 100 years ago, there was a war for the hearts and minds of the Jewish youth in Europe between Zionism and socialism, and attempts to compromise with labor Zionism. Right? But then there's another group of Zionists, the minority group. But that shouldn't deter you from identifying with them. Who see the Jewish people as a subject with desires, meaning that even if we could live happily ever after in Lithuania or New York or LA, with kosher restaurants and yeshivot and mikvaot and no assimilation and no security problems and no problems, we would still be willing to give that up and even our lives to see a Hebrew flag over Jerusalem. Because that's what we've wanted for thousands of years, and that's something worth dying for and killing for. Right? That's the minority group. But the minority group didn't just reappear 100 years ago. You know, a problem we have when we study history, our own history, is we have this big gap between Bar Kokhba and Herzl. But the reality is, almost every century, there was an attempt to restore Jewish independence to our country. There's Mar Zutra, Binyamin Ish Tveria, Shlomo Malchut, David Reuveni, Eldad Adani, even Shabtai Tzvi can be seen in this context. That over the centuries, Jews, or a small minority of Jews, have always tried to force what in religious terms we can call redemption, in secular terms we can call liberation, Jewish liberation. And basically what I'd say is that the things that Jews in these ghettos were praying for 3 times a day, once upon a time they really wanted. It wasn't just a race to Shema Kolenu. And they wanted to achieve politically. Like what we see in the Siddur is actually what we're trying to politically achieve for thousands of years. And a lot of it we have achieved now, or what we haven't achieved is within reach. But we're living in an incredible time where, if we had gone back in time 200 years ago and we spoke to a rabbi in Morocco or Baghdad or Lithuania and told him that one day soon there will be a Jewish state in Palestine, Jewish government, Jewish army, Jewish flag, Jerusalem would be the yeshiva capital of the world. He would believe you because he'd have a mitzvah to believe you. But it would be an act of faith because what you're telling him is so far removed from his reality. It'd be like me telling you now that the dead will rise. Tchiyat hametim. Right? That's what it would sound like to him. Now, we think we have a mitzvah to believe that the dead will rise. So he had a mitzvah to believe that the Jews will return to their land and achieve self-determination. But it was so far, how can that happen? In the world he lived in 200 years ago. So what a rabbi would have had to struggle to believe could one day happen 200 years ago, we're taking for granted. Right? We don't even realize that we're living in a generation where faith meets reality. Where the things that people had to really work on themselves to believe could one day happen is something that we take for granted completely. Now, I say Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut, on Yom Yerushalayim, with a bracha. And there's great halachic arguments on both sides, why you should, why you shouldn't. I think the halachic arguments why you should are stronger. But it's not just that I think I have a mitzvah to say Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut. The fact that I'm saying Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut, everybody knows what Hallel is? Can you define the term? Yeah, sure. Does anybody not know what Hallel is? Okay, It's a special part of the tefillot that Jews say on festivals. Like on days that we say that our God performed a miracle for us. We add this to the morning tefillot. And Yom Ha'atzmaut is the day that the British left our country, right? The day that we declared a state, the 5th of the Hebrew month of the Iyar. Now, when I say Hallel, when I treat this like a festival on the same level as Chanukah or Pesach, right? I'm making the statement that I could do something in my life and you guys can do something in your lives that will add another festival to the Hebrew calendar. That one of you or some of you or all of you could do something 5 years from now that will cause me to say Hallel on a new day for the rest of my life. I believe that, and I believe that's why you're here. I believe that's why we've been chosen to live in one of the most amazing and climactic chapters of Jewish history. That we should all be aspiring not to necessarily be the most successful Americans we can be, but to be the type of people whose streets will be named after in Jerusalem. That's what we're here for. And I mean, it feels good, by the way, to live on that level. Even if you don't get the street named after you. That's not the goal. The goal is to be living that kind of life where a street could be named after you. Not that you have to fight for the street to be named after you. Right? But, and it probably wouldn't happen in your lifetime anyway. But that's the goal. Now you asked about compromise. Right. So here's the problem. The problem is we're not defining what we want, and we're not defining what the Palestinians want. And they're not defining what they want, and they're not defining what we want. And I mean, we're really stuck. In general, we're really stuck not even recognizing the other's identity. So my work is really to bring the radicals from both sides, the people who are politically aware, who are very conscious of their own people's rights, their own people's history, their own people's aspirations, and who are willing to fight for those aspirations. I'm bringing them together. And I think that's a lot more productive than having, the Jew in Efrat talk to the Arab who's building his house in Efrat, or the professional diplomat from Tel Aviv talking to some American puppet in Fatah. I'm bringing the grassroots activists together. And they love each other, by the way. I mean, once they get over baggage that they have to get over, and there's a lot of baggage to get over. But they have a lot in common, and they live next door to each other. I mean, these are Jews and Arabs who live basically, in close proximity to each other in the West Bank and the territories, in the lands won by Israel in the Six-Day War.